of city staff. How many are business owners within the city? A couple of you. How many are residents in the city? Pretty much all of you. Students? Oh, great. That's great. Appreciate you all being here. The topic tonight is about connectivity, and it's really about the word in a broader sense of the definition, how you connect people, places, ideas, cultures, and so forth. And so the speakers tonight, Dr. Kerstin Carr will be our first speaker. She's the Director of Planning and the Environment with MORPC. She will be talking about the regional level. And then we have Terry Foegler, who is the Director of Special Projects for the City of Dublin, who has also served as Dublin City Manager in the past, has worked on several projects with Dublin and also the Ohio State University. He's going to give us insights about the local level or the smaller scale. And the idea is to start this community conversation about connectivity as we commence with the comprehensive plan and how all of that impacts what we do in the future and how we relate to the wider region. So without further ado, I will ask Dr. Carr to start the conversation. We have about 30 minutes total. At the end, you get to ask questions. We may ask you questions as well and see what we all learn. So with that.
Good evening, everyone. So excited to be here today and wrapping up your speaker series. I saw online that you already had really good and insightful presentations. So some of the information that I may be presenting might be repetitive, but hopefully put into a different light. And it might be helpful for you to hear some of this stuff again, because it's really important talking about the changes that are coming to Central Ohio and what impact that will have of our community and the planning in general. So as you already know, Central Ohio is expected to experience significant demographic growth along with a significant change in its makeup that also brings new and different lifestyle changes with it that will drive which type of built environment, including its transportation network, will be successful for the next 30 years. And while communities logically will continue to compete against each other to attract residents and businesses, it will really be critical to work together as well, because this growth is not guaranteed, and residents and businesses look at the region as a whole when they make location decisions. So if only a few communities are adapting to these new trends, the region as a whole will really lose out. And so I want to take a quick look back and then ahead of those demographic growth. So from 1960 until 2010, you can see that the majority of growth really occurred in those age ranges of childbearing and child-raising years. So the demand for single-family housing in large lots and good school districts was certainly most prevalent, and that's what our region focused on, and we were really successful in meeting that demand by growing with over 500,000 people during that time frame. Looking into the future, we expected to grow another 460,000 people by the year 2040. But this growth will be significantly different than the previous years. In the next 30 years, seniors aged 65 or older are expected to more than double. We will be much more diverse, and single-person households are projected to account for more than half of the total growth. So the demand for housing will now likely lie more on smaller housing units, with a stronger interest also in attached and multifamily homes. Now, there's still a significant amount of people who are looking for that standard single-lot homes, but we just can't ignore that new demand for other housing options. And in terms of an aging population, we are expected to live longer, stay more active, and also be independent. But as we grow older, we may not be able or want to maintain a large house. We may not be able to drive safely by ourselves, but we want to stay in the community and we want to stay independent. So for a community to provide those options to downgrade into a smaller house, to have public transportation and walkability to places, to doctor's office, to services is really important, because that allows that population type to stay connected. About 75% of retiring boomers said that they want to live in this mixed age and mixed use community that has proximity to services and is walkable. And those desires are very similar to the younger generations as well, who are looking for a sense of community and proximity to places to meet. And let's talk about those young professionals for just a minute. Young professionals currently fall in this category of millennials, which are people born between the 1980s and 2000s, and they are looking for a different lifestyle than their parents had. They are much more likely to live in urban and walkable neighborhoods, and they are more open to non-driving forms of transportation. In fact, the percentage of younger people choosing not to own a car or not to get a driver's license has significantly increased over the past 30 years. In 2012, the University of Michigan did a study and found that the percentage of 19-year-olds who don't have a license has dropped below 70%, which is the lowest in nearly 30 years. So that has significantly impacts on our transportation system. The Columbus Chamber in 2011 conducted a survey with young professionals, and they had about over 1,000 respondents reply that again confirmed their interest in a more mixed-use and diverse community. But what I think is even a stronger case for focusing on what our YPs, the young professionals, want is the fact that many of them are looking for a place to live first before finding a job. So essentially, they're narrowing down their job market to just a few key cities that exhibit the characteristics of a built environment before looking for their job. Previously, they tried to find their dream job and followed it wherever it would take them. That is not the case anymore for many of them. The National Association of Realtors does regular surveys of folks as well, and the one that just came out in 2013 showed that an increasing number of people are interested in walkability and mixed-use communities, and those are very important characteristics for them in deciding where to live. Now you see on the left, the privacy and school districts are certainly still important factors for a good size of the population, but having these so-called lifelong communities that are walkable and have easy access to other uses is growing in its importance. And the light green columns are a previous survey done in 2011. The dark ones are the ones done in 2013. And so you see that there's been an uptick in those categories of having sidewalks, being connected, being mixed use. So it's certainly a growing trend. And then they also look at the housing type preference by age, and they find that the attached and smaller lot homes are especially of interest to the younger group, younger generations, as well as to the older generations. Professor Nelson recently did a report for Central Ohio funded through the National Resource Defense Council on those trends and what that means for Central Ohio. And along with Ken Denta, who is a local real estate research expert, they both agree that those trends indicate that we may have an oversupply of large lot single-family houses and an undersupply of smaller lot and attached homes by 2030. And they also say that we are expected to have a higher percentage of renters versus home owners in the future, and that is actually already showing today. That trend is already happening today. And one last statistic I'd like to share with you that Professor Nelson put together shows that Central Ohio is predicted to add more than 300 million square feet of non-residential space between 2010 and 2040. And in addition to that, about 700 million square feet will be repurposed, redeveloped, or otherwise recycled. And his reasoning for this huge amount of redevelopment of non-residential space is that the average lifespan of those buildings is only between 40 and 50 years. So there's really a huge potential of redevelopment of existing strip malls and other office areas into more mixed use and walkable places once this lifespan of those buildings runs out. There's the chart that shows that lifespan of buildings and shows that homes actually have a lifespan of 150 and more years. Now, I'm sure that Westerville, just like any other community, is interested in maintaining and obviously ideally increasing their fiscal revenue and to ensure that residents want to move and stay in the city. And for a few years now, that term lifelong communities was used to describe communities that truly provide choices for residents to stay in one community grow up and old in it. And looking at these forecasts and the statistics, it seems that Westerville has an ideal opportunity to become this mixed-use community that offers housing and transportation choices and really creates an environment where people want to live and play and work and learn in. And I think in many ways, you already have that. I mean, just look at all the assets that you provide. And by the way, I was asked to speak in Hamilton County a few months ago about what Central Ohio is doing to deal with these trends, and I actually used Westerville as an example of the cool things that are going on here. I mean, you have the first bike hub and the only bike hub so far in Central Ohio, which is huge. So you're connecting to our trail network as a resource that can bring you serious economic development and value, and MORPC is currently studying the economic impact of trails on a region-wide basis, and Michael Hooper from your Parks Department is integrally involved with this. He sits on our steering committee, and hopefully that information will come out within a year or so, but it's looking at other region and other research that has been done in that regard. It seems that trails and the proximity to trails raises your property values and increases your attractiveness to businesses as well. And in general, having walkable communities, a lot of studies have done there as well, that the more walkable your neighborhood is and those houses within the neighborhood, the higher the home value for those homes as well. You're also one of the few communities in Central Ohio that actually has adopted a formal Complete Streets resolutions, really acknowledging that need for a transportation network that offers choices. So you're already on the right path to building what we call in the transportation world that multimodal transportation system, which is great. And not just that, you also have CODA looking at their first bus rapid transit line along Cleveland Avenue that initially will go up to 161 only, but I think there's a lot of potential for your staff, your elected officials, and for you as residents to advocate for CODA to elevate the BRT system up into Westerville as well. A lot of people think that transit follows businesses, but in reality, if you have a very effective and efficient transit line, it's a huge attractor for economic development, for businesses to get to, for developers. So I think having Susan Banbury, one of your city engineers, already on that committee looking at that is a good first step, but when you're doing your comprehensive planning effort, definitely keep that in mind as well. And then Nancy, I know, mentioned embrace your uniqueness, and she's so right. You have so many other assets here that you can leverage and build upon. You have your Uptown Westerville, you have your Otterbein University, you have the medical mile, I think what you call it. You have a beautiful park system, you have all those old ground trees. The city of Bexley was just designated as the first urban arboretum in the country. That's a big deal, and I think that's maybe something that Westerville could look into and strive to as well. And then you have access to Delaware County and all the lake system and the recreational activities there. So I really applaud you and the staff for developing this comprehensive plan that looks at all these different aspects holistically with the goal to plan for the future. And I just want to make sure that when you make these planning decisions for the future, it's really important to understand what the potential impacts are on the environment, the transportation system, your land, and essentially your bank account. That's how you can get the buy-in of the businesses, of your residents, and I know you're already doing that. MORPC has recently kicked off what we call a regional growth impact analysis, where we're basically looking at our 7-county region and applying different potential future growth scenarios to it, knowing that we might grow by 500,000 people by 2050. How could that growth look like? If it's sprawling, what would be the impacts on things like land consumption, water use, energy use, infrastructure costs, fiscal impact in general, household costs, traffic, all those things. So our regional leaders can make better decisions together with their residents of how the future should look like based on those indications. We hired Calthorpe Associate, who's a very well-known planning firm, to help us with this effort, and they're currently collecting the data that will then feed into the model, and we're hoping that by the end of next month, we'll have initial results to share with you and hopefully to react to, and that to then move forward with. The whole study is supposed to go until end of September, October. Terry actually sits with me on the steering committee, so he knows a lot about it as well. And Kim Sharp mentioned to me that you guys hired Kimberly Sharp to do some scenario planning for your community as well, and I think that's fantastic. And so I want to make sure that we are as helpful to you and are coordinated with our effort, so that Westerville potentially could become an example to other communities on how to do that scenario planning locally. But with that, I want to turn it over to Terry, who's really been one of my mentors and a true visionary for Central Ohio. And I think you will find his information helpful in moving your planning process forward. I'm a big believer of sharing best practices to reduce redundancy and duplication. And while Westerville is certainly different from Dublin, and you don't want to become Dublin, the bottom line is the same. You want to create economic vitality and property value stability. And I think some of the lessons that Terry learned through going through his process and planning work can hopefully enlighten you and feed into some of the work that you're doing here.
Thank you, Kerstin. I went back to Dublin in 2009. I'd been with Ohio State University most of my previous 15 years since I left local government, heading up campus partners and SciTech and some other related stuff at the university. But part of what interested me in getting back into local government were these very changes that Kerstin was talking about. When I first came to Dublin in 1990 as a director of development, it was this extraordinary boom in growth, and how do you manage this incredible endless number of subdivisions and office buildings and traffic and infrastructure and utilities that had to kind of come online. And I think part of what attracted me to Dublin was they had some resources to plan it. They wanted to try to plan it well on that, and they had the rapid growth, which is kind of a planner's dream, to try to manage and challenge. What attracted me back this time was, maybe hit the first slide there if you would. The slide that Kerstin shared with you, when you put them right above each other, and you can kind of see that blue in the slide on the top that really created our suburbs, not just in Central Ohio, but nationally for the last 40 years. That's what the explosion in single-family detached housing was. There's another graph we'll show you here in a minute that kind of depicts the blip that this was in time, that framed so much of how our regions developed. And most of our zoning codes and most of our comprehensive plans and a lot of our transportation planning and modeling that MORPC have done have kind of been based upon that. And most of our plans kind of assume that's what happens for the next 10, 20, 30 years. The next. Just to give you a sense here of the magnitude of the change, this is from a statement. There's if any of you get the Pew Research data, they have a real good one on demographics. They just produced a really great report that kind of summarizes some of the really key trends on there. But just think about this notion that every day 10,000 baby boomers turn 65 for the next 20 years. The growth of that segment is incredible. I think we're starting to see those in our suburban communities as the empty nesters begin to come, which raises the question, who behind them buys these homes and where do they choose to live, and what does that mean for suburban, urban, all local governments and regions in general as these changes take place. Another change that was in this Pew report that I thought real interesting was just the notion of diversity. And at the same time we're turning gray, we're becoming multicolored. In 1960, the population of the United States was 85% white. By 2060, it will be 43% white. So it's a radically changing population that we're also looking forward to. And the two trends here of kind of that level of diversification and the aging happening at the same time are extraordinary. And how we plan for that future with those two changes coming forward, I think, is the interesting challenge. This notion here from the Pew study I thought was real interesting. It just showed the growth in interracial marriages over time. This notion of how much the population is black and how much is Hispanic, all those things are becoming so much less meaningful just because of the interracial marriage that's occurring and going forward. So there's elements of diversity that are really hitting us in totally new kinds of ways. This notion of immigration, we hear big debate and discussion about immigrants and their implications. A lot of the nation's growth, and to some extent the region's growth, is based upon the projections of immigration. There was a real interesting graph in the Pew analysis here that kind of reinforces the notion it's the middle part of the last century that was the aberration. Our growth by immigration and kids of immigrants is really what's fed our growth for most of our development. So as you can see in the late part of the 19th century and early 20th, where it was European immigrants, now it's increasingly Central American, but it's projected to be a substantial part of the net growth. I saw some data by some previous studies that said if you took away first-generation Hispanics, their children and grandchildren, and projected out to 2040, our labor force is 6 million smaller than it is today. So we better hope that we have those labor force for growth purposes, and that really has been kind of the trend in the past. But regardless, it's major implications for us. If that's where most of the growth is coming, and we're counting on those folks to be in a position to buy our homes, the ones who are having larger families typically, and wanting these 4-bedroom, single-family detached homes, how quickly are they going to be in a position to do that? The studies that Kerstin made reference to strongly encourage you to take a look at those. The one on the left, Reshaping America, is Arthur Nelson's kind of national look at what the implications of these demographics might be on development, housing, and some other key trends. And then the kind of application of that to Central Ohio is also a report that I think MORPC has on its website that has just a lot of really good, interesting data to get us to start to think how different is this in the next 10, 20, 30 years than what we've been experiencing. Just some of the things that struck me from that study. About a third of the change of population between 10 and 20 will be attributable to seniors. That's very significant. The new majority, comprising all racial ethnic minorities, will account for nearly all the growth. Between 2010 and 2040, households with children will make up about 1/4 of the total household change. Single-person households account for more than half of the total change. Dramatic difference from what we've been experiencing in the last 30 or 40 years. This graph just helps reinforce that notion there of what portion of the housing, or what portion of population growth attributable to the various age segments there. So you can see in that last 40 years the size of that orange. That's what fed our suburban growth and development. That's what fed this massive amount of single-family detached housing. You can see in relative terms what a relative small piece of the demand in growth is. So the new growth, the new demand beyond what we have, it's a relatively modest player. Doesn't mean there won't be any. It just means it's a lot less significant aspect of growth going forward. Homeownership rates, a lot of data on that, but part of the stuff that Nelson suggested here, that even if we keep the very high homeownership rates that we had kind of at our peak, based on these demographics alone, we would project, he projects, that the rental market share of the growth is about 48% of all housing. If in fact the homeownership rate would just go down to 60%, which is kind of where most people see it going, on that 65% of all the new housing demand would be for rental product over the next 20-year period. I mean, that's just a radical shift in terms of things that we're used to. So when we see all the apartments and hear about them and kind of think of what near-term impacts of are we overdeveloping and at what point is this stuff going to get saturated, clearly those near-term market considerations are valid. From a longer-term perspective, no question, very significant amount of the housing that's going to be demanded is of that type. More data. I think one thing that struck me as I went through this data was how unusual Central Ohio is. The rest of Ohio basically has no growth. The rest of Ohio clearly has all the single-family detached it needs. The rest of Ohio is much more in a state of decline, and Central Ohio is kind of the shining star with it. So that's the really, really good news on it. It's still a radically different form of growth than what we've had for the last 40 years. Another graphic that was put together by Arthur Nelson that just kind of looked at the national prospect of the housing types based on the 2030 demand and what the difference is. And you can see what many people are projecting, kind of this net excess of kind of single-family detached homes. Good news is we're not having that today. I noticed my neighborhood folks with no houses going up. I've heard that higher-end suburbs in Columbus right now have an extraordinary shortage of available products. So I don't know what the precise timing is when folks will be advised to say, here's where the tipping point has come, and all us empty nesters with 4-bedroom homes and no kids are going to be trying to sell at the same time or not. But right now the market's in very good condition. This notion of what drives development, especially from a suburban perspective, I think it's important to try to get your arms around what has fed that demand for growth and development in our communities for the last 40 years. This baby boom generational housing bubble that we mentioned, I think, is a really big piece of that, and that's basically over. Now those folks are now turning 65, and 10,000 of them will turn 65, and they will begin to sell. And we'll touch a little bit here on some of the graphs to indicate what the implications of that are. There was a study done in 2008 by a demographer at the University of Southern California and showed the rate at which folks start selling homes, which depends on states, but net sellers nationally begin about age 65. They sell more than they buy. And as the age goes up, they sell much more than they buy. The notion that the growth is primarily in folks who are selling housing as opposed to buying housing versus those who are coming online, the supply that will be made available by the existing stuff being sold will really mitigate the demand for new product. And there's a lot of good data to help feed that. The next 4-year demographics are nothing like the ones that we've experienced. Economic development drivers, as Kerstin mentioned, are changing. We're in Dublin, have all this 10, 20, 30-year-old office development set in suburban office park settings. A lot of indicators beginning to point to the fact that's less likely where companies want to be and where workers want to be. How do you keep that stuff competitive for the next 10, 20, 30 years? What is it about those environments maybe that we need to revisit? Projections for the amount of new typical suburban office development going forward, much more conservative than they would be if you look back over the last 10, 20 years. And we understand, just as Kerstin had mentioned, I remember when I was with Dublin in mid-90s and we were working with the Bob Walters bringing Cardinal out. I mean, it was, you wanted a community where the CEO wanted to live and the top executives wanted to live, and that's what you did when you were trying to promote your community. They are increasingly, and I had subsequent discussions with Bob Walters as his son's firm was making decisions about where to locate. It's where his workers and the creative talent want to be on that, and they told him that wasn't Dublin. They were looking at much more urban kind of settings for that. So I think increasingly as we talk to HR directors and our companies and hear from our leading firms, places to live, places to entertain, places that provide kind of environments that talented young workforce wants are increasingly things that we believe will add value to the economic competitiveness of the suburban communities as well. The things that Dublin kind of looked at when we evaluated this whole notion of, okay, things are changing. The drivers that drove us for the last 40 years aren't there. We think economic development is shifting. We understand that the big demands are going to be empty nester and to some extent single-person households for lots of other reasons and the desire to attract young talent. When we looked geographically at do we have areas in the town that can accommodate that, we tried to look for places that do we have enough candidates. And one of the things that Arthur Nelson makes reference to in his studies, you increasingly see a lot of these older suburban commercial strips that are kind of wearing out, big boxes that are having a tough time getting reused. When he makes his case for the age, and we build those buildings to be throwaway frequently, 10, 15, 20 years, how do we redevelop those in ways that maybe reinforce the kind of environments that we're trying to create? Are those part of the answer? I think he gives a very too simplistic version of that answer because he kind of converts the estimate of what that is and said it would accommodate all of our future growth if we develop it in a much denser way. I think the odds that where people want to live and work just happen to be lining those corridors is probably low. But it's worth looking at it. It's probably a piece of the answer. And as folks look at that locally, look at that regionally, clearly those are going to be elements. In Dublin's case, we had, if you're familiar with Dublin Village Center, pretty much a dead center. We had Bridgepoint at 161 in Riverside, which was very high vacancy, hadn't been successful for years, but a very important strategic decision, location. Just north of there, we had the Bash driving range on the Vrabel property. In a typical suburban format, has a 50-foot drop to it, depth to bedrock's just a few feet. If you were trying to do that in a typical suburban way, you'd be trying to cut into that hill, create a sea of parking with a building. It's just not economical to do, so it has sat there for all those years. So we started to look at some of these sites, went to OCLC, who realized they were sitting on a 100-acre campus, for which they didn't need the vast majority of it. And they, as an asset manager, started to say, maybe there's some stuff about this site that we could get more value from and create a better environment for employees. So they retained Forest City, other companies, Cooper Carey, as the design firm to begin to look at can we establish a more urban, mixed-use, dense environment that might help us meet our economic objectives of attracting and retaining young talent, as well as get some more value on these land assets. So there was enough stuff in our Bridge Street district, and I'll show you a map that informed that in a minute, and I think enough sense on council's part that we have a much more modest little historic downtown. You've got a great bundle of urban fabric in your downtown here. That the community wanted a lot more of it, but there's very little opportunity right in that downtown given the scale that it is, which is very much kind of the 19th century village that it is, to add this dense, walkable, mixed-use kind of environment. The other piece that I think we wanted to look at was if we were to advance something like this in that geography, what's it mean to the rest of the community? Is it an asset that adds value to all the rest of the office and housing pieces? And I think one of the speakers we brought in was a gentleman named Chris Lineberger, who now is with the Brookings Institute, and real interesting guy. He's written a book on the case for urbanism, and he comes from a private development background. Robert Charles Lester, the development feasibility firm, he co-founded that years ago, so he's very much from that kind of mindset. But we had him come in, and he's given some presentations locally, but the vast majority of this dense, walkable, mixed-use stuff, from a percentage basis, is happening in suburban settings. And he projects for the next 20 years it will. Now, if you look at the total amount of development that's taken place in suburban versus urban cores in the last 20, 30, 40 years, it's been overwhelmingly in the suburban areas, have captured most of it. And he still believes for the foreseeable future that will be true for the denser mixed-use stuff. I think you will see the core areas infilling, especially young professionals who are seeking those increasingly. To some extent, empty nesters. I think empty nesters, what we're finding in Dublin, very much would like to have options for places they could walk to restaurants and have other kind of environments around there. This alignment between what the young professionals are looking for and what kind of empty nesters are looking for is very, very strong. They both want that same kind of walkable environment. They like places to go to eat and shop and be nearby. So the notion that we've got two really strong constituencies, one kind of driven by economic development and one driven by the fact that we just don't have places where those folks in Dublin who want to stay in Dublin can retire, on that, I think, have reinforced this sense publicly that this makes sense. One of the things we realized as we look at this deal was that to unleash this kind of density, I mean, the biggest expensive piece of it is structured parking. Right now, what causes us to use land so inefficiently in a suburban context is the sea of parking that we have to put when we put up a suburban building. There's a metric, I don't know if you guys have used it much here, floor area ratios, which is, in a suburban setting maybe 0.2, but it relates to how much building you get per acre. And when you start to look at how much land gets consumed by parking in those surrounding areas, which totally defeats the walkability that you're trying to achieve once you've done those things, you got to figure out ways to get structured parking. The biggest single thing we felt was viable for that was typically we've done non-school TIFs when we've done our tax increment financing. We approached our school district about a year ago about the notion to say we have to capture the vast majority of the school tax increment from this if we're going to make this kind of development happen. And really approached it from a couple different perspectives. One is to maintain the competitiveness of Dublin's remainder of its real estate value and corporate competitiveness. That was going to be necessary. The kind of housing that was being built wasn't housing with kids, so it wasn't adding to the net demand on their facilities. And if you this notion of FAR that I looked at, if you look at the value per acre of when you hit these densities, what it does when those TIFs burn off, and they're much more long-term investment buildings as opposed to 10, 15-year throwaway buildings. The fiscal impact to the school district at that point just becomes extraordinarily great. What we've done with the school district, we've done that deal. Both sides have approved it. The city of Dublin is going to cut a check to the school district of $1.5 million a year over the period. And what we do for any development that initiates in that 30-year period, the first 15 years of it, we capture 100% of the school district's portion of the new increment. And for the next 15 years, 90% of it. There's safeguards in there to the extent that we would be putting more money than what's being foregone because we can't do that legally in there. So we think we've got the tools in place to help underwrite the costs of the structured parking. This is just the geography of the Bridge Street District. You can see the 270, 161, Sawmill. It kind of emerged from the vision plan to give the character of the density, the nature of a grid that would establish this, which is totally different from our suburban networks. You can see the Scioto River north-south there, but that was just more to give a feel than to be a precise plan. What City Council spent 2.5 hours reviewing last night was this proposal from Crawford Hoeing, which is that land I mentioned to you along the east side of Riverside Drive. That's a roundabout that's now proposed for Riverside and 161. Riverside Drive gets pushed to the east, and a park gets established between it and the river. A new pedestrian bridge that connects the historic district with this new development, and where it hits Riverside on the east side would be kind of where the restaurants and other activity. But this reflects about, in their phase one piece of this, about 2.5 million square feet of development and about $300 million of total investment. What they've got proposed right now is essentially all of the parking is structured, but for what is on street, and all the streets have on-street parking on them. The slopes help that happen. You're able to tuck the parking in by virtue of the grade, and it actually becomes a big value benefit. The roundabout, for example, there, and this was designed before any Bridge Street stuff, is 10 feet above the location of the current intersection. That puts Bridgepoint Shopping Center in a big hole. That happens to accommodate about two levels of underground parking without having to take down. So there's a lot of stuff where we designed the public improvements hand in hand with developers looking at the private improvements that they would make to try to get them where possible to reinforce each other. This still has a lot of challenges to go through. You'll hear Crawford Hoeing talk very optimistically, ready to start, let's go build. We haven't done a development agreement with them yet. Getting that level of structured parking funded, 800,000 square feet of structured parking, is going to be incredibly challenging and difficult. But they've started with kind of the most ambitious approach here. They've done a tremendous amount of planning. This is basically through schematic on their side, and they want to get through the formal development review process. Full range of housing types to accommodate all of those various niches of various price points for young professionals, whether it's somebody just getting out of school working for Cardinal Health nearby, up to more seasoned professionals who just want this kind of environment, as well as a lot of empty nester product, townhomes, as well as 5-story buildings. There's a number of buildings that have first floor retail, restaurant, 1 level of office above it, and 3 levels of housing above that. So we've got quite a bit of vertical mixing. We'll see where this goes. I'm not making promises with regard to it. Having done a large-scale mixed-use development down at OSU, I know the challenges that faces these things. But it's clearly showing where development is heading. I mean, this developer has put many millions of dollars into the project already. They have bought most of the land that you see there. And have retained some of the best design talent in the country to help get it there, and have staffed up for its implementation. Wagenbrenner interests have interest in a number of sites for some very nice mixed-use development on the other side of the river. And we're dealing with folks on a few other key sites. There's many, many sites that aren't ready for redevelopment and won't be. But as the useful life of those buildings get to a point where the economics of redevelopment makes more sense, we'll explore those with them. But that's the the approach Dublin did. Started with the broad analysis, started with the broad demographics. Does it make sense? People bought in the idea, community supported the idea. Then we did the testing of traffic, utilities, fiscal impact analysis, market assessments, and those kinds of things, and ultimately adopted a form-based code to accommodate this development, testing it with developers, seeing what the level of interest would be, and we've got quite a bit of development in the pipeline now. The challenge on us is to make it happen and kind of push forward with it. I don't know if there's anything else after that, or no, happy to answer any questions. I think both of us would that you may have, or discuss any items.
Really appreciate the two speakers. I think we'd like to follow the format we used at the other two meetings and ask you if you heard anything that surprised you, shocked you, stimulated some interest in how that relates to Westerville. So if anybody has any questions, we'll direct them to the speakers. Mr. High.
We started off, there's a lot of extrapolations of the future. The world today has the Easton, North, the Brewery District, the Grand Parts. Something's trying to be created in the Northwest. Maybe we're trying to extrapolate. When do the pendulum start moving back the other way? are we destined to overbuild?
We have about 15 minutes to get questions.
I think the challenge that planners in the 90s and early 2000s who were saying we really ought to look at denser, more mixed-use, walkable kinds of stuff. And we'd say, but the market keeps wanting this. You know, this is what we're seeking. And when you bring Chris Lineberger in, he said totally rational response to kind of where the market was, what it was seeking, large number of families, the demographics that were driving it, made total sense. I think as much as anything else is driven by those demographics. If the suggestion would be, who's to say it's not going to be a lot more dispersed, low-density single-family housing and drivable retail? I just don't think the demographics are there to support it. I think if you see what's happening from a retail perspective, the drivable stuff is dying far worse than anything else. It's the retail strips in a lot of these areas, the highway commercial stuff, and the way retail is changing itself and becoming much more experiential. It's working much more. Easton kind of worked to try to create the appearance of a town on it. That's the town center model of kind of retailing. That's the way shopping centers are done now around the country. I think the challenge for local governments is how do we create, like you've got in your downtown here, authentic, real mixed use on that. And it's a challenging thing to produce. I think the developers are now, they weren't doing this 5 years ago at all. You see the scramble for the infill sites all the way around the kind of the cool urban locations to get the multifamily, and the rents are just going through the roof. That was happening in other markets for a number of years. Columbus is now starting to catch up. It's happening in suburban markets around the country. Anybody who's looking at the long-term demographics and the implications for housing is all coming to the same conclusion. I think what some folks who will say, it's not all move back to the cities, it's not all dense urban stuff that they want, and they're right. There's a lot of gradations of this in terms of walkability and styles and densities that are going to kind of play out here. But I think most folks are thinking, have come to the conclusion that the demographics aren't there to support the large lot, low density, single family expansion. What we got to do is preserve the value and demand of the stuff we've already built. And the nature of retailing is changing a lot. And increasingly, the empty nesters are without question the major growth group here. Are they seeking big lots out in the middle of nowhere? Or are they seeking experiences that kind of keep them with other people, let them walk to restaurants and stores and groceries nearby, great green spaces and parks? And those demographics aren't changing. The things that will change on demographics might be, are we going to have the number of immigrants that we thought or not? Is it going to throttle off? Is Mexico and Central America so healthy that they're not going to come to our country for opportunity? I mean, those things you can tweak a little bit. But most of these demographic projections, whether it's Census Bureau, Pew, or anybody else, it's all within 1% or 2%. Ken Danter, who kind of does the market analysis for most residential developers in town, I mean, when you saw him give his presentations for the last 4 or 5 years, I remember him saying, well, in this year, we've got 4.6 buyers for houses between every house in this price point. And then next year, we're going to have 3.1. And 2 years out, I project we're going to have 1.5. And 3 years out, we're going to have maybe 1 buyer for each seller in that price range. That's just demographics driving that. That's not anything else. And so when we talked about those homeownership rates, where we have the highest rate in the world for homeownership rates because we've subsidized it with interest rate reductions and everything else, are our kids and young people, do your kids want homes the same way you did when you were their age? My daughter's 35 years old in Seattle. Last thing she wants is a house to take care of. Same thing with my son, and he's moving to San Diego on this stuff. And we hear those stories all the time. They're seeking something different. So to expect it to stay at the same rate that it was, I think is hard. So if it's going to be different, the demographics are going to drive something different. How do you prepare for it? How do you shape it? I think the continent was that enclosed, kind of artificial, let's make it feel like it's a French street that you're walking up and down. Most of the town center concepts, even though Easton is extremely successful, many other folks who have tried to create those kind of what I call Disney-esque shopping centers, have as many of those has failed as are succeeding. Nobody builds an enclosed mall anymore. That's almost not built anywhere nationally in terms of that product. You talk to anybody in retailing and leasing, you know, the amount of folks who are out there seeking to lease space as they did before, given what's happening with online sales and all the other pieces there. They're much more conservative. We've got to monitor that stuff, see what the implications of it are. But I think if we keep our plans and zoning pretty much intact, thinking it's the same old, or even if you're relatively fully developed and you're saying, what do I do to kind of keep these things competitive, preserve values, make it a place where people want to be, and maybe add new layers on top of the great quality of life that we've got now. You need to just think through what the options and the alternatives are.
Add something to this as well. If you ignored all those demographic trends and you just looked at it from a fiscal perspective, I don't think you would be able to afford more sprawling development either. And I think that's where the scenario planning process comes in really handy, to look at what those potential impacts are of developing the way that you have developing over the last 30 years or developing more compact. What does that mean in terms of your infrastructure costs, the services that you need to provide, the utilities that have to go out there, versus trying to reach 40 people on 1 acre with the same utility line to 2 people per acre with that utility line. Your costs will go up significantly as well. So that's another consideration that you have to make as a community. Can you even afford to, if you wanted to ignore those demographic trends, could you even afford to do that?
Doesn't seem to be a following of the job.
I would say the residential is catching up. You saw pretty good office development happen in the Arena District. You're seeing some office interest emerging in Grandview Yards in some of those locations. You're seeing the smaller kind of creative office space where the kind of marketing and design firms are increasingly wanting to be there. So there's clearly elements of that where that's starting to pick up. We just had a consultant go through our suburban office, pretty much looking from 161 down to Tuttle, Franz to 270. And I think it's a real challenge to keep that space competitive in the long term. I think the notion that Dublin, looking out 33, and Dublin still has plans where it says more of this suburban office stuff, I think very, very little will happen. I wouldn't focus, when I was city manager, I said I wouldn't focus my energy out there. I think the trend is going away from that. I think that'll be stuff that becomes increasingly less competitive with time. What surprised us on the Bridge Street project that I showed you is Crawford & Holding's gone out and started to market it, is the level of office interest they're getting, because there isn't any of that suburban kind of dense walkable stuff. Even when you see Easton, it's kind of plucked off to the side, and the housing's kind of plucked off to the side. It's not really walkable. It has a sea of parking around it. I think this notion, particularly kind of what I would call the creative office space that can serve the other kind of companies with the kind of marketing firms and design firms and other kind of creative space there, and a place for young folks that can have some living opportunities there, I think enhances your economic competitiveness significantly. Dublin has to think through, just like Westerville, as this stuff ages, how do you keep it competitive over time? I think part of what we will be looking at is, are there ways to densify and mix uses in old traditional suburban office parks? Are there ways, should we, as we locate buildings, if we're still saying for the next 10 years, pretty much going to be traditional suburban stuff, but let's locate buildings in a way so that maybe parking can go away, other buildings and structures can replace it, so that as it has a market to densify, we've laid it out and planned it in a way that can do that. So maybe where you position buildings, those kind of things. But I would closely monitor the trends, the new development that you're building, and anything that can kind of create environments that gear more towards where companies are increasingly wanting to be, which I think is in more dense, mixed-use, kind of vibrant environments, would try to carve out some of those opportunities.
I agree with Terry that there's a lot of catch-up being played in Columbus right now and downtown to build those residential units. But when you look at some of those residential apartment buildings, you actually notice that the lower floor level is often reserved for retail, office space, restaurants, and so on, creating this mixed-use feel and environment in a somewhat residential area.
Yeah, the only surface parking is on-street parking. In that plan you saw, there is no surface parking lot anywhere. So, and what the plan currently is kind of a permeable pavers that kind of define that on-street parking. But for all of these items here, all these kind of land uses, that notion of parking being adjacent to the sidewalk, and the streets are all two-lane roads with on-street parking. So the parking for most of the buildings is beneath the buildings. There are a couple of elevated structures that are fronted at least on two sides by development on that, but the vast majority of them happen because of the slope by virtue in the kind of the cut of the hill on there. And so they've taken 100 borings to know exactly where the bedrock is and kind of lay those things out. That's the biggest financial gap to fill. The notion of being able, you can't charge for that parking. If it's creating an extra $10,000, $15,000, $20,000, per space of cost, how are you going to underwrite that cost? And that's one reason for the very aggressive TIF. But I think this reflects probably the most aggressive scenario that you could paint on there. We'll see if it's able to be worked out financially or not. They can't do it at Grandview Yards. Grandview Yards has a lot of surface parking and planned and structured. Easton can't afford all structured parking. Even downtown, you see how much there is devoted towards kind of surface parking. So it's, but if you want to create the walkability and the density, you got to minimize the intrusions of lots of surface parking.
Odds that anything that you've heard that you think is
The conflict come in between sort of the desire to have green space
I mean, if you were to look, if that amount of development, that 2+ million square feet of development were to happen in a conventional suburban setting, just to accommodate the parking, it would take another 25 acres to accommodate. So just think of how much more surface runoff and everything else with that. Part of what the city is planned hand in hand with this, as I mentioned, is moving Riverside Drive to the east to create a great riverside park. Today, you don't even know the river's there. Riverside Drive goes along it. You think there's a nice river down there. And really, it's not an asset that's being utilized at all. So the city has acquired in the last 12 months, 14 months or so since I've been there, virtually all the acreage on both sides. The acreage that you see on the east side of the river will be a much more manicured kind of park with a variety of things in it, pedestrian bridge. The park, which is low and more flood prone on the other side, will remain very natural, have some paths through it, and connect to the Indian Run Creek on there. So there's that great civic core space, and I would say our civic core increasingly moves to that river and becomes the old historic core on the one side and kind of the 21st century version of that on the east. We also have standards in here that developers are struggling with a bit in terms of neighborhood parks, pocket parks. We have a major green lining one of our major grid roads that goes through here. There's plazas that are being incorporated. Internal to these multifamily buildings are rooftop greens over parking areas and others. Key in an urban location is to make those green spaces usable, enhance walkability, make them so they provide a nice form of relief, and then have parks strategically located. We got another development coming in from Casto on a property, and they showed us a concept yesterday, and it has like a 1+ acre green right on one of our major streets, right in the middle of it, that they picture all kinds of events taking place around. So I think it's much more valuable, better, higher quality than just the landscape mounds that we put around parking lots that do nothing but hide parking lots. I mean, I don't think that green does anything for anybody other than make a less ugly parking lot to look at, which has some value, but in terms of its utility or improving walkability, it does very little.
We have one last question.
So you had a lot of assumptions. Probably. Oh.
some in an urban area, they like that, but you have a big nation and to say that this is the model for everybody. There's a lot of places that lived out west that lived in Alabama, a lot different than people live in Boston, live what they want. You get a lot of people telling people this is how you're going to live. A lot of thought, a lot of various things. Bottom line is, what they said that the types of population when they exceed that was classified became unclassified. Of course, the media, they don't tell you what you need to know. We're not talking about physical stuff. Oh, matters of the news and the now, how many bridges that need to be repaired. Talking about medical, I mean, damn. PO did an audit on Medicaid and Medicare. They said that the cost is going to go down. There was it's not just physical structure. You have to wait.
If I could comment to your one point there. One point that you made with regard to telling everybody how to live. The vast majority of people in Dublin and Westerville, regardless of what happens, will continue to live as they live today. Those neighborhoods aren't going away. The housing isn't going away. And for Dublin, as I indicated, maybe 6% of the city over 30 or 40 years it would develop in a different way. I think if you look at the demographics, which I think vary by a tiny amount, if we're assuming that there's going to be the same amount of growth that's going to feed a new housing demand for a very different population, much of which is older, much of which is single person, increasingly wanting large lot single family housing, I don't think anyone would conclude that. I think preserving what we have, knowing that most of the population in Westervilles and Dublins will still be suburban, family-oriented development at the end of the day. But there's a layer that has to be accounted for. We have to figure out, given these demographics, where and how the region's going to accommodate it. I think each local community kind of will have to conclude and decide for itself how it chooses to do that.
And that's pretty much what I was actually going to say, is that the comprehensive plan, as we look at that, we're not looking at eliminating one type of housing versus another. I think it's looking at where the community goes in the future and preserving what everybody loves about the community. And we hope that all of you will continue to be involved in this planning effort, because those are the types of things that we want to hear from you about, what areas we should be focusing on preserving. And the scenario planning that you heard about is one of those elements that in a couple of months we'll be starting to discuss with you to see under different scenarios how the community could develop and what the community's preferences are. So with that, we very much appreciate our speakers tonight and appreciate you all coming. We hope you continue to be involved.
Thank you.